You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com, the ChrisVossShow.com. Hey, I did that pretty good. Maybe I should sign up for opera. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We certainly appreciate you guys being in the show. We have amazing returning guests and journalists on the show, multi-book author. I think you're going to be amazed to hear his story of what he'll be talking about. As always, refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Remind them that they're a family that loves you but doesn't judge you, the best kind of family there is. And some people say the only kind of family that there really is. So we love you unconditionally, just as long as you don't write me and ask me for money. So stop doing that, please. Especially you, Bob. Poor Bob. Anyway, guys, go to youtube.com/Chris Voss, iTunes.com. Give us a great referral over there. Give us those 5 stars that we love to see. Those that make my day when I see them come across in the morning. Also go to all of our goodreads.com/Chris Voss, our big LinkedIn group, the LinkedIn newsletter, all those crazy places you see the kids playing these days. He's returning guest on the Chris Voss Show, wrote a bunch of amazing books. We got him for the last one, and he's here with his newest book that's coming out August 9th, 2022, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan by Elliot Ackerman. And this thing is going to be pretty interesting to find out about Afghanistan. Of course, if you're familiar with the history or you're watching this video 10 years ago, that will get you caught up on what happened. He is an acclaimed novelist and memoirist who breaks down his involvement in Afghanistan into 5 phases that focus on his combat deployments in the country as a Marine infantry officer, as a CIA paramilitary officer overseeing Afghan commandos and counterterrorism units, and he is coordinating with colleagues to oversee our Afghan allies' evacuation from the airport the week before the Taliban took power in August of 2021. Wow, it's been a year. The Taliban victory was really more of an unconditional surrender by the U.S., Ackerman notes. This book, while not being a comprehensive analysis of the full 20 years of Afghanistan, is a powerful testimony of what went wrong despite the bravery of the American military personnel and our Afghan allies. Welcome to the show. How are you, Elliot?
Good. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Good. It's great to have you as well. I started getting the whole bio of the book there. So there you go. Give us your .com so people can find you on the interwebs, please.
Easy. ElliotAckerman.com. 2 L's, 1 T.
There you go. And I'll hold up a picture of the book. Of course, in the final copy, we'll have it right between us. Give us what motivates you. How many books do you have so people can look that up on the interwebs as well?
This is my 8th.
8th book. Congratulations, my friend. So what motivated you want to write this book?
Yeah, it wasn't really a book that I was planning to write. And as things were happening in Afghanistan last summer and everything was collapsing, my book editor reached out to me and said, maybe we should do like a kind of a short paperback book, kind of about what happened in Afghanistan, republish some of your essays, we'll do it quickly. And I said, okay. And that was like at the beginning of August. And then everything happened at the airport last summer, this total collapse of the American presence there, Kabul falling. And by early September, I kind of wrote him back because I'd been involved in a lot of the evacuation efforts. And I said, hey, I think this is going to be a very different book. I think it's going to, talk about Afghanistan. And as you mentioned, kind of the arc of the whole war and these 5 acts over 20 years, but it's also got to talk about the evacuation efforts. And so in the book, I write about 5 different and distinct efforts that I was involved in of trying to get people out of the airport. And those are each woven through the book. And lastly, I also wanted to write about something from my own past that I'd never talked about before when I was fighting in Afghanistan, because through this whole thing that happened last summer, the question was kind of, what does it mean to leave no man behind? And that's what I think a lot of us are wrestling with, with our Afghan allies, is how do we get out of Afghanistan, but also stay true to this idea that we don't leave our people behind. So I wanted to write about an instant in my own time fighting in Afghanistan back in 2008, where I felt like maybe I didn't do the best job of living up to that standard. I write about an ambush that I was involved in many years ago.
Wow. So the 5th act, the title of the book refers to the 5 stages of your interaction with Afghanistan. Is that correct?
It does. I mean, listen, when you're going to write a book about Afghanistan, the thing that's tough is how do you write a digestible book about 20 years of war? Mm-hmm. So as things were collapsing in Afghanistan, I work as a journalist. An editor friend of mine reached out to me and said, "Hey, Elliot, could you contribute like a 500-word essay to what's going on right now in Afghanistan?" I said, "Well, I don't really know if I'm going to write anything right now. And what do you want me to write in like only 500 words? Maybe you could describe everything that's going on because a lot of people haven't been paying attention to Afghanistan." And she said, because this whole thing is just such a tragedy. And that was the first time someone had really said tragedy. It got me thinking. I was like, well, if you look back in classic, like just dramatic structure, tragedies from like Horace and the Ancients to like William Shakespeare are typically told in 5 acts. And so the 5 acts of the book are, they're Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and the 5th act is the Taliban.
Oh, wow. Wow. So you broke it down by presidential thing. The 20-year war, we left almost like we left Saigon. I mean, it was almost watching those planes was almost like watching that helicopter atop that thing with a line of people trying to get out.
Yes. But, and there was a lot of talk in the lead up to the withdrawal of, many members of the administration saying this isn't going to be a Saigon. That's not going to happen. In many ways, it was worse than Saigon because when Saigon fell, like, yes, you could watch it on TV. And if you were a Vietnam veteran or had spent time in Vietnam, it was disturbing to watch. But in Afghanistan, you could watch everything on TV. Mm-hmm. But, we all have these phones.
Yeah.
So my phone was lighting up with every, Afghans I'd served with 10, 15 years ago, many of whom had immigrated to the United States who are now American citizens, but saying, my sister is still there. I can't get her out. My uncle is there. They're going to cover him. My brother still works for the Americans. So everyone, whether they were a veteran, a journalist who had been tied in with Afghanistan, they were getting pulled back in because unlike Saigon, people couldn't reach out on social media when at the end of the Vietnam War. But in the case of Afghanistan, they could, and their voices were being heard and loudly, and many of us were trying to help.
Yeah, and the stories were heartbreaking. I mean, you saw the guy who, the people clinging to the planes. I think there was at least one guy who was killed because he tried to ride up on the plane and was thrown to the ground. The story of the pilots that said, "We're not deboarding the people on this plane. Fuck it, we're out. We're going to fly them out, and that's it." It was extraordinary, and to see the babies being tossed at the soldiers. I mean, when you think of I remember writing about this just on Facebook, but when you think of the love of a mother that she has for her child, I mean, you're not going to take her child away from her without her putting up a fight. But for her to throw her baby to give it up to what she figures will be a better life in America. What an extraordinary probably might not be the best word. What a heartbreaking, or I don't know. It's a human moment, I suppose.
Well, I think that, we can offer up words about what it's like to live under the Taliban and, what all of the Afghans who allied themselves with their government and with the Americans were hoping for with regards to the future of their country. And we can try to intellectualize that. But an image like a mother, as you said, who loves her child so much that she will hand that child to a stranger with the hopes that they'll have a better life, or a person. I mean, that the Afghan who fell to his death from that plane was a young soccer star. Mm-hmm. The desperation that he felt that he would hold on to the landing gear of an airplane to try to get out, speaks to in very evocative ways how desperately so many Afghans didn't want to see their country regress to Taliban rule.
Yeah. And then, of course, the return of, what was it, Omar Khalid? I can't pronounce his last name.
Yeah, it's Zawahiri.
Yeah. And the fact that we basically were going back to what, was going on 20 years ago. I mean, it was almost like every dollar we spent. We were talking before about how I saw a recent photojournalism shot, and I think it was the New York Times or WAPO. I think it was the New York Times. But when the photojournalists land, they have all the guns that we left behind in a hurry. They have all of our equipment, millions or billions of dollars probably, and just to see that. So let's get more into your book. What are some stories that you want to share, some teasers that we can tease out to get people to pick up the book, and maybe some things that you really stood out for you in it?
Well, as I mentioned, the book sort of, it tracks like the arc of these 4 presidencies in the Taliban. So, you do get the politics and the context of what was going on in Afghanistan, but it's a memoir. I mean, it's a personal book. And as Kabul was falling the last 2 weeks of August, I was actually on a long planned family vacation in Italy, of all places, with my wife, and we have 4 children between us. So it was the juxtaposition of being kind of pulled back into this war that I thought in many ways I'd left 10 years ago. But while also trying to, be with my children. And when writing the book, I felt that was very important to keep that in because I wanted to show how I think for many veterans in particular, because there, was really no coherent response on the part of the administration. Like, of course, we had soldiers and Marines, and I'll be very clear, at the airport who were doing heroic work in incredibly difficult circumstances, but that was not, a policy. So what you saw was this basically crowdsourced, what many people call the digital Dunkirk, of veterans and others all just trying to facilitate Afghans getting out of Kabul International Airport. And so, the book kind of goes through these 5 different instances. And I was working with a number of, journalist colleagues of mine. And what I sort of figured out quickly was that the value I could add was I still had lots of contacts in the military who were there in Afghanistan. And so, for instance, there were 2 Marine infantry battalions at the airport. A battalion's about 1,000 Marines. And one of those battalions was the battalion that I had fought with in Iraq in 2004, the 1st Battalion of the 8th Marine Regiment. So this is like my old unit, just by coincidence, happens to be at the airport. And the colonel commanding that unit happens to be one of the guys I went through training with when I was a 23-year-old lieutenant. And so in the book, kind of what happened, what I write about is you see how at the end, it becomes this very personal experience of everyone, myself included, just using our contacts to, Chris is at the airport, Jack is at the airport. I'm going to call him up, and then being on the phone, which is surreal. I'm on the phone with my kids in Italy talking to one of my good buddies who I haven't, we haven't talked to him in a year or two, but we're old comrades from the war, being like, hey, are you at the airport? Yeah, I'm at the North Gate. Do you need help? Yes, I do. And how that played out and how we were, trying to help folks get through all the security who had worked, with the Americans and with the Afghans so they, wouldn't fall into the hands of the Taliban.
So the book documents the desperation, and it must have been heartbreaking for you because you've got people on the phone desperate. For some people, if they've advised the U.S. government, their lives are on the line if they're hunted down. I believe correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the Taliban promised they wouldn't hunt people down, but they did. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
We're actively going when they got into Kabul, house to house looking for these people. And I think what was also surreal too was you're actively making lists.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like the movie Schindler's List. So you're adding people to manifest after manifest. So you're getting emails and text messages. And, 2 friends of mine who were journalists were actually in France where one of them lives. And they were the ones keeping these manifests. So I would get emails, and I was just one of many people who was having this experience, but I was getting text messages saying, this is a friend of a friend who's in Afghanistan. Can you help him or her?
Wow.
And I would send them to these guys who were making the lists, and they would say, well, we have, a flight that might leave in 2 days. I'll put them on the list and we can try. So the morality of making lists, who gets on the list? It's a very disorienting thing to realize that, you're in the process of figuring out, who is going to live and die in these circumstances.
Yeah. You were a CIA paramilitary officer. Do you talk about in the book about what was interesting was the CIA chief, I believe, flew into Afghanistan, if I remember correctly, and met with the Taliban leader? It was really kind of interesting. Do I have that right in my memory?
Yeah, I don't know if that happened exactly during the fall, but there was the agency was also getting a lot of its people out at that times too. And I write about in the book one of my very old and good friend of mine from the Marines who since went into the agency. He was very instrumental in helping a pretty large group of Afghans, nearly 200, get out one night. And I think as Kabul was collapsing, there are many instances of people like him who, don't necessarily know every single person who's coming through the gate, but knows that so many of them need to get out. And because there was no formal process here, it kind of came down to, as I said, this crowdsourced process with people saying, well, I might not know who this person is, but I know who this other person is. And he's saying that person's okay. So let's get them in and get them out.
Yeah.
And it was really kind of a collapse, a collapse of American competence and morals in these last days in Afghanistan. While at the same time, individuals are, I think doing things that were pretty remarkable.
It was the story of the CIA director, William Burns, having a secret meeting, but it was after the fall of the airport and everything. Yeah. Hi, folks. Here's Voss here with a little station break. Hope you're enjoying the show so far. We'll resume here in a second. I'd like to invite you to come to my coaching, speaking, and training courses website. You can also see our new podcast over there at chrisvossleadershipinstitute.com. Over there, you can find all the different stuff that we do for speaking engagements if you'd like to hire me, training courses that we offer, and coaching for leadership, management, entrepreneurism, podcasting, corporate stuff. With over 35 years of experience in business and running companies as CEO, I think I can offer a wonderful breadth of information and knowledge to you, or anyone that you want to invite me to for your company. Thanks for tuning in. We certainly appreciate you listening to the show, and be sure to check out chrisvossleadershipinstitute.com. Now back to the show. Do you think we could have held, do you talk in the book about this? Do you think we could have held at least the Capitol if we really had our heart and minds into it, or?
Well, as a point, yes, if we had our heart and minds into it, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to always keep in mind, right, that like war is politics. So political will is not just sort of a secondary consideration when you're talking about war. I mean, listen, we have the 82nd Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division and our Ranger battalions, like they exist to seize and hold airfields.
Yeah.
So, but there was no political will for it anymore.
Wow.
The United States military, more than 1 million strong, got chased out of Afghanistan by 50,000 Taliban members.
Jesus.
And that is not indicative of necessarily the incredible fighting prowess of the Taliban, although they, certainly had operational patience, but of the fact that, there was just no will left anymore for Americans to stay in Afghanistan.
Is it just indicative of that country? Do we just come to some summation that just like the British and the Russians and everybody who's tried to modernize that country, or I don't know if modernize is the right word, but to try and, bring that country out of the tribes, the tribal nature of it, is it just indicative of that country that we just can't get their culture? I don't know. I'm not sure what the appropriate thing is to say. It sounds like it's almost Zionism if I say we're trying to change their culture, but maybe that's what we were trying to achieve. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, there was sort of one of the truisms of the Afghan war when you were there was people would often say, in Afghanistan, the Americans have the watches, but the Taliban have the time.
Wow.
So, we had all the technology, all the resources, everything, but the Taliban knew they could just wait us out. So you can look at Afghanistan too, and you can say, listen, Afghanistan, we fought a 20-year war. That's a long time to fight a war. But if you look at the arc of those 20 years, kind of at any given point in those 20 years, we were always about 18 to 24 months from a troop withdrawal that we had announced.
Wow.
So we were never able to convince the Taliban or necessarily the Afghan people that we had both the watches and the time. And a lot of that, again, goes back to politics. I mean, listen, when President Obama announced his surge in Afghanistan in July of 2009, in a speech he gave in West Point, he announced both the beginning of the surge and the date of our withdrawal in the exact same speech. I was in Afghanistan when he gave that speech. So that had very real consequences. I would sit down in tribal shuras that I frequently did, where you're trying to convince, local leaders that, hey, listen, what you want to do with your people is you want to align yourselves with the Afghan government and the American forces because they're the future of your country. You want to be in bed with us. They would look at you and say, listen, I know you guys are going to give me a road and you want to do this, and you want to modernize, and that's all great. But I've got a Taliban shadow governor and he lives down the road. And your president just came on TV and said, you're all going to be gone.
Wow.
Years. And so that Taliban shadow governor, he's not going to be gone.
Yeah.
He's going to kill me. So I'm sorry. What do you want me to do?
Wow.
trust me, like people in Afghanistan, like they watch TV. You know, when President Obama gives a speech, they watch the speech. So listen, does that all mean that, I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, say, oh no, we would have won the war. But, acts like that certainly don't help when you're trying to convince people to align themselves with the Afghan government and our efforts there.
It was extraordinary for me to watch the people just give up. Like, and when we were through, like the people that we left behind, and they're like, yeah, we got them trained. They're gonna fight and defend their country, and they're just like, fuck it, and they just basically surrendered, city by city, block by block, as it went down. I kind of realize now, and looking at that and what you just said, that they're just like, okay, well, the America's leaving, so we know who's taking over, so we might as well just roll with it.
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think the way that we left, just like from a tactical perspective, was very difficult for the Afghan military because we pulled out all of our enablers too. So suddenly they don't have the logistical infrastructure to do their own medevac or call in close air support anymore. So all of the sort of advantages that they had, because yes, they were flying their own missions, but when their planes would come back, we had contractors who would help them maintain their planes. So they weren't fully self-sufficient. So they lost a lot of military capability when we left. But I think your broader point, people could see which way the wind was blowing when we left. And, war, the great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz famously said, war is politics by other means. And people could see politically which way the wind was blowing. And so they, as you said, city by city, you saw it all roll up. We saw a very similar thing in Iraq in 2014 with the Islamic State, when they sort of swept through huge swaths of Iraq too. So it's always important to really keep the politics at the moment front of mind when you're seeing these military developments.
That saying really applies to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine too, as
Absolutely.
well. I mean, that's really interesting. What was also interesting in Afghanistan was how we try and create an economy and Americanize or Westernize everything. We did that with Iraq. I remember soldiers talking to me about how, no one had electricity. And then we set up electricity, we pump it into houses. Then when the electricity dies, they hate Americans. And they did that in Afghanistan, where they were, I think they were one of the largest, heroin, poppy seed dealers ever. And I think now they've flipped to something else. But, and then we go in and destroy their whole economy that they have for that and tell them, okay, we need to rebuild. And, somehow you can just Americanize or Westernize everything and pop up McDonald's, and then suddenly everyone has money and picket fence and 2 cars in the garage, which we don't either. So I don't know what we're trying to sell over there. So that's crazy. 5 acts of the book, and your personal experience, I think, was kind of interesting because it belies to the reader how personal this is for you, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's, I'm just bringing up my experience. I don't think it's an outlier experience. I think, many people, they're kind of, who are involved in the war, their life kind of arc this way. But I was 17 years old when I kind of got on the path to head into the military. I'm 42 years old right now. And the war kind of permanently ended last year. This is more than half my life. This war I've either been participating in it or it's been kind of operating in the background of my life. And all my best friends are the people I served with in the wars. I mean, so this is something that's very present. And as the war was ending, was, as I mentioned, very personal. It's, it's my all the contacts in my phone are lighting up, my WhatsApp messages, guys I'm usually texting with about, if we're going to have dinner with our wives this weekend. Now suddenly we're texting about, getting out the extended family of our interpreters. So yes, it absolutely has this sort of the end of the war. It ended in a very personal way. But, Chris, what you were saying before kind of had me thinking as well, that, one of the things that was always interesting to me, Iraq versus Afghanistan, I served in both, was, in the Iraq war, we invaded in 2003. I first went there in 2004. When you would sit down and you would talk with Iraqis about kind of what does peace look like? And, how do we sort this out? There was always a sense with them that yes, peace was this state we were in before. Yes, it was under Saddam Hussein and it wasn't great, but there was peace and they knew what that was. And it was the idea of returning to a state of being that had once been. The war in Afghanistan began in 1979. So when I'm sitting down with that tribal elder and I'm trying to convince them that, we got them to be on the side of the Afghan government and the Americans and then we'll have peace. Mm-hmm. Well, the average life expectancy in Afghanistan is around 63 years old.
Wow.
So, anyone who's under like 50 or 45, which is most of the population there, when you talk to them about peace, you're not asking them to like revert to a way of being that had once been. You're literally asking them to imagine something. They have to completely imagine out of whole cloth.
Wow.
Right? Because they've never known peace,
Yeah.
unless they have no adult memories of peace or weren't alive when there was peace. And that is, a real challenge. It's a economic challenge. It's a cultural challenge. And ironically, too, as we get to the end of this war as Americans now, it's become a challenge for us as well. And for me, because it's 20 years of war. In my entire adult life, there's been this war going on. And, a friend of mine, I write about at the beginning of the book, named Jack, he said to me once, he said, man, the sad thing is that we grew up over there. And it's really true. And I think that is unique from the American vantage point of this war is, what does it do to a society to go to war for 20 years?
Yeah. And you look at the cost of what we spent over there, but not only the cost of what we lost over here, the stuff that wasn't reinvested in our country. And, it made me think to what we've been talking about too, when you're there trying to sell peace to these people who have no idea what peace looks like. As Americans, we know what wartime is like, we know what peacetime is like, but you're trying to sell peace to those people or, hey, let's all do the thing. They're just going, hey, the Russians came here and sold that thing. The British came here and sold that crap. We just know how this goes. You're a visitor, a tourist here, and you're going to go. And I can imagine that may be their mindset.
Well, like any place or any country, right? Like the Afghan people are not a monolith. So on the one hand, you have many in that country I came across who, wanted that peace, wanted to see things modernized, didn't want to regress to a Taliban way of life. Others who, obviously were aligned with the Taliban. And, unlike a country like Iraq, a much more segmented society, regionally, tribally. Afghanistan has a very long history of having, somewhat fractious alliances and being fiercely independent. One of the things I really came to appreciate in Afghanistan is, there are just many ways that the Afghan mindset and sensibility of how they think of their liberty is very recognizable to any American as well. A good buddy of mine who grew up in, Western Appalachia, we used to tease him and call him the American Pasha because he was, a guy who loved to hunt from the hills of Appalachia. And like when we were fighting in northeastern Afghanistan, he just, he fit right in with the Pashtuns up there because he felt like the culture was sort of the same.
Mm-hmm. It was really interesting to me. I watched some video one time of talking about the drug issues over there, the heroin addictions, the opioid addictions and stuff like that. And there was, they were talking about, training these soldiers and trying to get them to fight, and they just wouldn't fight like Americans. And it was almost like we cared more about fighting for the country than they did. Is that an accurate picture of what those soldiers over there, or what is the accurate picture, I guess?
Well, I think it depends on the units that you're with,
mm-hmm.
right? So, but one of the, after September 11th, we come in and the Republic of Afghanistan is founded, and then there's going to be the creation of the Afghan National Army, right? And so there's a question there. What should that Afghan National Army look like? So if you look at Afghanistan, sort of the tribal and regional bonds in Afghanistan and familial are very, very strong. And in many ways are, at least if I've observed, are the source of so much of the Afghans' reputation as being these incredibly fierce and effective fighters.
Mm-hmm.
But if you created an Afghan National Army that was all sort of like regionally located,
mm-hmm.
the challenge that existed if you built it that way, where, there was heavily, units were all from the same tribes and same families, was that you would wind up with warlordism and a very weak central government in Kabul, and those warlords could become a threat to the central government in Kabul, right?
Wow.
So we said, no, we're going to have a national army. So we're going to recruit from the whole country. So if you're like a Hazara from northern Afghanistan near Mazar-e Sharif, you can go fight in a unit down in southern Afghanistan in Helmand province, which is like heavily Pashtun. And because we're all Afghans, that's fine. The challenge is that a guy who's like a Hazara from northern Afghanistan, if he's fighting in Helmand province, like that guy is as foreign to Pashtuns from Helmand province as I am. He doesn't get any advantage of being Afghan per se. So that's where you kind of wind up with some of the dysfunctionality that existed in the Afghan National Army. Conversely, when I was a CIA officer, the group of Afghans I advised actually didn't work for the Afghan government. They worked for the American government. And as such, they were recruited locally. So it was all guys from the same tribes, same families. So like, for instance, when, the private soldier loses his night vision goggles, his squad leader is probably his cousin who's going to smack him on the side of the head and be like, you can't do this because it's, our family, you're going to give our family a bad reputation. These units were actually much more cohesive. But the challenge was you couldn't adopt that policy on a national level because, again, it had this threat of devolving into warlordism. I just bring that up because it's, this tension that exists between, recruiting people locally in the military and creating something that's really kind of multicultural and national across Afghanistan, is a balance that you had to get right. And in many ways, there's sort of parallels to the similar balances we've had to find in American life, right? The tension that exists between the rights of the federal government and the rights of state governments and local governments. And the way any society draws that balance, whether they do it effectively or ineffectively, can ultimately lead to, the success or failure of the society. And in Afghanistan, the balance was never totally right.
Watching what was happening in Afghanistan and Iraq, where, we kept trying to sell that peace, but also we were trying to sell, Westernism, Zionism and our stuff. I've been trying to find this here on search, but somewhere in the Bush administration, one of the people wrote a document that was, I think it was somebody with Cheney, Dick Cheney, who wrote a document that talked about the Zionism, nation building and Zionism, I think it was, if I recall right. I can't seem to find it on search. I don't know if you remember that conversation, but it came out after the war started, and I think probably a little while after, that the intent of the George Bush administration was to promote Zionism or nation building, or, basically setting up satellites or franchise of the U.S. thing in the Middle East. Do you remember that? What I'm talking about?
I don't remember really, Zionism per se. I think there was always a tension that existed as to, okay, what is the objective of the war in Afghanistan, right? In early days, it was, and by early days, the days right after September 11th, it was, to bring Osama bin Laden to justice and to deny terrorists a safe haven in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
But then it sort of starts to veer in 2002 and 2003 into this idea of nation building.
Mm-hmm.
That we're going to create a free and democratic Afghanistan. What does that mean? It gets fuzzy. And then you have sort of this broad mission creep where sort of over the subsequent, decade plus, no one can really agree what the war is about, whether it's about counterterrorism, about nation building. And the fact that we can never agree what the war is about and what the objectives are of the war, I would say, is one of the key reasons why we end up losing.
Yeah. And do you think we really misread the population, like in Afghanistan? I know in Iraq, we didn't realize how much Saddam Hussein was keeping the Sunnis and the Shiites from, going full civil war on each other. And I remember reading some different things that a lot of the people who were advising the Bush administration didn't realize, like Rumsfeld, didn't realize that unleashing those two to fight with each other would basically be the downfall of the war. I don't know.
Well, with regards to Iraq, right? Anytime you come in and you topple a government, you create a power vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't necessarily have a complete and total say as to what occupies that power vacuum. And so, I think Iraq's an interesting case, because the stories we tell ourselves about war really matter in terms of how we strategically behave. So for instance, in Iraq, a story we were telling ourselves in Iraq was, we're going to come in. Saddam Hussein is such a brutal dictator. When we get rid of him, the Iraqi people will greet us as liberators, as though we got rid of Hitler. And we were telling ourselves these Second World War stories that were not apt. And so, for instance, one of the reasons Saddam leaves, one of the huge strategic mistakes in Iraq was the de-Baathification, of getting rid of the Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party. So if you ever worked for the Ba'ath Party, you weren't allowed to have a government job. You weren't allowed to serve in the military. So we completely eliminated this whole category of Iraqis who, weren't necessarily Saddam Hussein sympathizers. And we did that very much echoing the denazification policies after World War II, right? But then the result is there's this huge vacuum. So who's going to be in the Iraqi army we're trying to build if it can't be anyone who was in Saddam Hussein's army? Who are the administrators who are going to run all the Iraqi cities? And it was no one. And coming into this vacuum, you wind up with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and you wind up with deep resentments amongst many Sunni Iraqis who've been aligned with Saddam, who are people under different circumstances we could have potentially aligned with us. Now, if we go to like Afghanistan, there's somewhat of a similar failure there because we conflate after 9/11 Al-Qaeda with the Taliban.
Mm-hmm.
And they are different, right? I mean, first of all, Al-Qaeda, Arabs, Taliban, Afghans, totally different, right? And then the Taliban as a group, we are not, once they don't give up bin Laden, we won't deal with them. In 2002 and 2003, times when we could have potentially tried to integrate certain elements of the Taliban into the Afghan government, we don't do this. And so by completely isolating them, you wind up by 2005 and 6 with a new insurgency in Afghanistan. But again, we were telling ourselves the wrong story.
Mm-hmm. And then you had ISIS. They'd been around since 1999, but then they really, rocket ship to power over what's going on from the disarray of everything. I mean, it's really funny. When I was reading books as a kid, I remember reading, I think it was 1,000 Days about the John F. Kennedy administration and the story of, the Bay of Pigs and how the CIA was trying to, overthrow the Castro government, et cetera, et cetera. And there's lots of, segments of our history where we try and, muck up governments and put our thumb on the scale and do our thing. And we end up doing something worse. Saddam Hussein, we created the monster, funded him, gave him a ton of money. And then, we end up on the wrong side of that stick. And we have like a history of doing this through at least 100 years, I'd guess. And we just never learn. And so it's good that we have books like yours, because I think a lot of people have fogged over the memory of Afghanistan in 20 years. And, the saying I always say is the one thing man can learn from his history is that man never learns from his history. And so we need books like yours to bring us back and remind us and to document the failures so that hopefully we don't do them again. Vietnam, Afghanistan, who's next?
I don't know. And it's tough to not overlearn, the lessons of history. You want to learn the lessons, but not overlearn them in a draconian way, right? It's often been said, history doesn't repeat, that it rhymes. Mm-hmm. And you kind of have to look for the patterns, but then also see the way certain situations can be unique. Like, for instance, what's going on in Ukraine right now, I think is, how do we process that after what just happened in Afghanistan? First of all, I would argue that, Putin's decision to invade Ukraine is absolutely connected to what happened a year ago in Afghanistan. Which was the single greatest military defeat that NATO had ever endured. And then 6 months later, Putin invades Russia, which is, Putin invades and basically believing that there will be no NATO response. But then there is a pretty strong NATO response that keeps Ukraine from toppling. And so how do we understand these things? Is Ukraine Afghanistan or is Ukraine Poland in 1939? Like, we don't know. But to be fluent with the history, it matters because you have to be able to kind of try to situate these events outside of a vacuum.
What do you think most people are going to learn or come away from with your book?
Well, I hope people will get kind of a more personalized view of, of the Afghans who are coming here and why they're coming here and who these folks are. The heroes of the book are some of the families I write about and what they were doing to get their loved ones to America.
Wow.
Our values as Americans are universal values, right? They're not just American, and they appeal to people no matter what passport they carry. And so to see the lengths that many Afghans would go to make a life here, I think should make us stop and say, wow, maybe we've got something that's, that's worth a damn if these people are going to fight so hard to come here. So I hope people to come away with that. I hope they'll also come away, thinking about, okay, how did we get to a place as a country where we just fought a 20-year war?
Yeah.
And our relationship with our military and how we make war. Every war the United States has fought since our founding has had to been fought with a construct. By construct, how do we continue this? How do we continue the war in terms of blood? Meaning, who's going to fight it, and treasure, how we're going to fund it. And for instance, like the Civil War, first ever draft comes out of the Civil War, as is the first ever income tax in American history. World War II, characterized by a bond drive and a national mobilization. Vietnam, a very unpopular draft. The War on Terror, the way we fund it is in terms of blood, our all-volunteer military, and treasure, deficit spending. We put the entire thing on our credit card, so there's never a war tax. The last year the United States passes a balanced budget is 2001. It's not a coincidence. So the result is the entire American population, unless you serve in the military, have a loved one who serves in the military, is anesthetized to the war. We don't feel it. Hence, the war goes on for 20 years. And is that a healthy way for a democracy, for a republic to wage war? I would argue that it probably isn't. That, our political leaders shouldn't get a blank check to go to war. And the way they get the blank check to go to war is they put it on the credit card and they have an all-volunteer military do it. And that is not helpful.
Yeah. And I remember them saying about the war, they're like, if you don't vote for the war, if you're not with us, you're with them. It was a very interesting spin they put. One of the things that will probably haunt me a little bit is you mentioning your Schindler's List of people. I imagine there's people you haven't heard from that may have disappeared, or hopefully they'll turn up somewhere crossing a border or something. But I imagine there's people on that list that you may never hear from again.
Yes, and there's people on that list who I still hear from, couldn't get out, and are still trying to get out, and it's become very difficult to get anybody out. So, how do you turn off your phone? You can't just turn off your phone, right?
Yeah, desperate times, and I imagine there's quite the danger of contact and stuff like that. So I encourage everyone to read your book, and you've written some great books over time. But yeah, this one's important that we learn from it. And you making it a human story and integrating what has engaged your whole life in it is quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah. It's definitely something that, I don't know. I've watched that war for 20 years and thought, what are we doing? How are we doing it? Does this make sense? And, to see the way that we left it and the way it just completely fell, it was extraordinary. And I never thought about the point that you made that, Russia looked at how we ran off and probably encouraged them in that, in the Ukraine.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you're Vladimir Putin and you're weighing whether or not you're going to make a move into Ukraine, and the only thing that's stopping you is there going to be a strong NATO response, and you watch the images coming out of the airport in Kabul, which is a NATO mission, you're like, there's no way these guys are going to do something. I mean, they can't get up the will to fight against, this Taliban. I mean, they're taking terms from 40,000, 50,000 Taliban fighters. I mean, what are they going to do against the Russian army? So absolutely, they're connected. I think that probably what really surprised Putin was that there was a strong NATO response. Let me say, it surprised me for the summer that there was a strong NATO response.
Yeah, and even for commercial businesses and stuff.
Yeah,
they're taking quite the hit over there. Just extraordinary times that we live through. What's the old Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times.
Yeah,
take it from Bobby Kennedy's speech. Thank you very much, Elliot, for coming on the show. Give us your .com so people can find you on the internet, please.
Sure. I'm Elliot, Elliot, Ackerman, ACKERMAN.com.
There you go. Thanks, Monis, for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, and all those places the crazy kids play, LinkedIn, etc. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe. And we'll see you guys next time.